Hello and welcome to Skipped History. I am joined today by Dylan Gottlieb, Assistant Professor of History at Bentley University. Professor Gottlieb is a co-host of Who Makes Sense, a History of Capitalism podcast. He has written for the Washington Post, Gotham, the Journal of American History, and Public Seminar. And most recently, he is the author of what I find to be very timely work called Yuppies, the bankers, lawyers, joggers, and gourmands who conquered New York. Dylan, do you want me to call you Dylan or Professor Gottlieb?
Oh, Dylan is great.
Cool. Dylan, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks so much for putting a little extra English on gourmands. A funny word that I did not choose, but appreciate it.
Who chose that? Your publisher?
Well, it's always a negotiation with the press. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
But I'm not
Yes.
complaining because it's found its way into many readers' hands with this title.
Here's the
no
book
complaints.
for anybody wondering. Yes, well, gourmand enchanté. Let us begin. So I just need to put this up top. We're recording this interview. It's Thursday, June 11th. It is 10:08 a.m. It's approximately 9 hours or so, 10 hours since the Knicks won Game 5 of the NBA Finals. Yeah, I had to check to see if that was real. The finals, the Knicks have 3-1 in the finals.
Unbelievable.
I am losing my mind. It is gone.
So I was fully weeping last night when they cut to Clyde in the stands. Like,
Oh,
while
wow.
Clyde Frazier he's kind of my honorary grandfather. I've been with him for so long.
Yes,
Watched the
yes.
outfits get crazier
Yes.
over the years, and watching
Yeah.
him just elated, thinking about 53 years ago when he, last brought it home.
Yeah.
I got emotional.
Yes. One of the greatest Knicks ever. Maybe the greatest Knick ever until maybe now. No, he's for anybody who's unfamiliar, apologies to anybody who's not a Knicks fan watching this. And also good to know that we share a same adopted grandfather from a distance. This book is actually, so this is a really good book.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll get into it. I mean, the name suggests what's going on. I need to get a grip. But the Yuppies, your book has really been on my mind as I've walked around the city over the last few days, as I've watched these Knicks games and felt like I was watching District 1 of the Hunger Games, like with everybody who could afford a ticket to be there and all of us, everyone else sort of pushed to the outer boroughs. And yeah, I think in many ways, as someone who grew up in New York, what you describe in this book about the history of Yuppies, about the history of financialization, it has put words to things I've felt for a long time, including why I am such a marathon hater, by the way.
I am also not a runner, just a critic.
Okay, well, it's weird. It's weird because I play a lot of soccer. I like to run around, but I've been a notorious marathon hater, and people don't get it, and I haven't gotten it, but maybe you've helped me understand them, and I do feel a little bit validated. And yeah, so let's get into it because I think this book has reverberations far beyond New York City and shapes in many ways national politics as you talk about in the book and beyond. So let's begin. I'm going to go with a quote because this is to talk about financialization. I mean, your book...
A big scary word that I hope to make less scary for listeners.
Yes. Well, I think my listeners might remember, we've talked about some of the history of financialization, particularly through the work of Mirza Baradaran, who's been on Skipped History a few times. And what you're talking about in the 80s really reminded me of her book, The Quiet Coup. But you say... Okay, so you say greed, contrary to but people saying that greed, accounts for, like the greed was a new thing on Wall Street in the 1980s, like we're sort of taught through.
Or the morality play of Wall Street, the movie, or any number of journalistic accounts, right?
Yes, or Wolf on Wall Street, like greed is this new thing in the 80s. You say greed was always good on Wall Street. That didn't change in the 1980s. But what set the decade apart were the economic and institutional changes that elevated Wall Street, making it irresistible to an entire generation of young professionals. So some things happened that drew young professionals to Wall Street in ways that they'd never been drawn to it before in the 80s. Can you talk about some of those changes, please?
Yeah, so we talk about financialization often at an abstract level. We see it on a graph. We watch finance become the largest source of profits in the American economy in the mid-'80s. We've seen it on a graph. There it is. And it's incontrovertible and it's true. Others have theorized all the different reasons that that happens, and we can get into the weeds if we want to. And I acknowledge those and cover them in detail. Everything from the deregulation of the banking industry to looser antitrust regulation to allow mergers and takeovers
Mm.
to a whole host of things that New York City specifically does to render itself a banking free trade zone and
Yeah.
sort of make an offshore zone off of the coast of the United States, on and on. But I was
Offshore
interested,
zone in downtown Manhattan.
quite literally off the coast of the US, but
Yeah.
sort of absolved from Federal Reserve requirements.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to do was tell this story as a social history, to understand how, not in the realm of morality, not in the realm of bloodless statistics, but on the streets of New York and in the imaginations of young people, why does Wall Street move to the center of everything? How does that happen? And how do they come, quite literally, to move to New York to chase their fortune? That's a new phenomenon. You know, in the mid 70s, only about 3%, 4% of the Ivy League is headed to Wall Street. It's a job mostly for WASPs who had family connections to Wall Street,
Mm.
or those who were already sort of destined for it, and they picked up the phone, called their uncle, and there they go. They have a job at Morgan Stanley.
Wow.
But as it becomes an
what a
incredibly
sad destiny. But yeah.
right, but the economic fortunes of our nation are changing profoundly in the 1970s, and banking is elevated as a source of potential profits by our political class, which sees it as a solution to the declining profits in manufacturing.
Right. So when you say
So,
economic fortunes are changing, you mean there's
yeah.
this? Can you elaborate on that
Oh,
momentarily?
absolutely. I mean, it's a larger and complex change how we move to the finance at the center of our economy, but it involves new pools of money. All those worker pensions are piling up in, say, CalPERS, the California Pension Fund. Money market mutual funds are piling up. And at the same time, particularly the Volcker shock, interest rates are off the charts. And so in order to protect capital, in order to seek returns, uh, financiers turn to new sorts of securities and new ways of investing that are riskier, but at the same time being deregulated by political elites who see them as an opportunity to maintain America's primacy. As our manufacturing advantage ebbs, perhaps finance could be the thing that propels
Right.
America into a new age of growth. And
Right.
this is a bipartisan project we'll talk about later, probably in the politics. It's left and right who are profoundly enamored with
Right.
finance. Chuck
Right.
Schumer is a prominent figure in this book.
Right.
So anyway,
Theoretically left and right. We could probably put all those
theoretically,
people
right?
sum up right. Yeah. But
We can talk about that too, the spectrum.
yeah.
But for young people, this is felt most powerfully at their universities that they're
Mm.
attending. And
Mm.
importantly, there's a change in the population at elite universities at the very same time. This is right after the women's movement, the civil rights movement have thrown open the door, or at least let's say cracked open the door to the elite institutions in American life. So now the reservoir of the most meritocratic young strivers is not just the WASP who could call his uncle at the bank. It's also a young Latino woman who's the first in her family to go to college. It's the Asian bond trader, future bond trader I spoke to, who grew up, his dad owned a laundry, right? And these people
Yeah.
see banking as increasingly profitable, which it is. And also they're being drawn into what becomes a recruiting pipeline that the banks are setting up, because they need, in order to enact financialization, they need workers on the line, you might say, every day, vetting the deals, dreaming them up, placing issues. And that takes workers. It takes literally bodies on the line on the trading floor to do that work.
Yeah.
And they go to the Ivy League and other elite schools and begin hoovering up an entire generation who's, not coincidentally, more diverse and thus more indebted, more interested in chasing
Mm.
what's lucrative and prestigious.
Mm.
And it's actually the path of least resistance. This is something we have discovered if you've ever gone to one of these schools.
Yeah.
35, by the end of the 80s, 35% of some of these Ivy League schools is headed to Wall Street, 10 times as much as just a decade before.
Yeah. And these are, they're going to Wall Street instead of going into manufacturing jobs, you're saying, or going to places like Detroit, where maybe they'd work for GM and they end up heading to a place like New York City.
Right, there's a spatial reorientation and a
Yeah.
sectorial one as they reject big
Yeah.
conglomerates and manufacturers and go to Wall Street instead.
Yeah. Yeah. They sort of move away from these more union backed or union associated industries. And I went to Pomona College in Southern California, one of these elite schools where this is, many decades later, but as you talk about in the book, there we are still living in the world of this yuppie transformation. And I remember I was not highly sought after by by any of the industries.
That's
you
to your
talk about.
credit, though, probably.
Oh,
You're more interesting.
But I did go to a Google info session. Like Google recruiters came to my campus, and I was
Hmm.
curious to see what it was like. And immediately I was like, "Oh my God, they're not looking for me, and I'm not looking for them." And but I did. It was a very fun experience because and Google, of course, I think we could argue. I think as I think about as I something that was coursing through my mind as I read the book, I was like, how do we define yuppie today? Like, what industries would
Mm.
yuppie be? And of course, Wall Street, I think, is in there. Lawyers, the legal world, as we're talking about, or we will talk about, was in there. But I think tech is obviously like probably,
Yeah, it's a historical progression. So Wall Street in the
yeah,
80s creates this institutional connection between these schools. They literally career services offices are created in the 70s to act as a clearinghouse for this more diverse set of students that need connections to get a job.
yeah,
Well, in the 90s, it's management consulting that taps that same institution. By the 2000s, it's tech. So they're following in sort of the
yeah,
grooves that Wall Street has created in the 80s.
yeah, yeah. And you're just reminding me. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of personal connections to this because I worked in tech for two and a
Mm.
half years. I would say I remember it took me, I think, let's see, it was in June. So it took me about 4 months, I think, for me to, while I was there to be like, this is never going to work for me. And on an instinctive level, something was really off. And also, just like in that info session with Google, I was like, what the fuck is this? Now, I'll just point out quickly that as is I've learned characteristic. I did do a lot of research beforehand. So when they were asking questions about the history of Google, the only
Ah.
person in the room who knew the answers was me because I just like read the Wikipedia page right before walking in, which made for quite a dynamic. Okay, just to toot my own horn.
Yeah,
So
seriously.
I mentioned I mentioned the world, the legal world that
Mhm.
rises alongside this world of Wall Street, this influx of young people who are heading to Wall Street from college campuses. And you also alluded to this somewhat that there is this expanding diversity in these worlds. Now, an expanding diversity in part because this history intersects, not coincidentally, with the history of student loans beginning to explode and college tuition also beginning to explode.
Mm.
Some histories we've also talked about before. But so you talk about this rising diversity on one hand and also rising exploitation on another hand. Can you elaborate on that some and maybe within, weave in this explosion in the sizes of law firms at the same time?
This is sort of a puzzle for me because I know many of these people, at least they're modern day incarnations. I know these
Mm,
lawyers have worked in big law. I know people who've worked at banks.
mm,
And even though they're atop the social hierarchy in terms of earnings, and you would think they'd be delighted to be there, they're actually quite miserable, especially in their junior years when the work is being heaped upon them. Their hours are utterly out of their
yeah.
control. They're complaining, even amidst astronomical salaries that I will never attain in my long academic career if I'm to have one. So that felt like a puzzle. Like, how do they reconcile their working lives and the rest of their lives? Well, so
Yeah.
what I did was dive into the working conditions in the law firms in this era that are doing the financial deal making. They're sort of the handmaidens to the banks. They
Mm,
need
mhm,
lawyers at
mhm,
every
mhm.
stage of the transaction. Many of these deals, in fact, are pioneered by lawyers who are the sort of more creative 10,000-foot view of the takeover game.
Yeah.
And what I realized is they too need an army of associates to do the grunt work of financialization.
Mm,
It's not
mm,
just the partner who sees it all at a 10,000-foot view, it's room after room of associates in windowless conference rooms, checking
mhm,
documents,
mhm.
confirming contracts match, ferrying papers to the SEC. I interviewed one banker who, fresh out of Georgetown Law, was literally a courier for deal documents. That was his job, to make sure they got in time to the SEC to clear a
Yeah.
merger. So the work they're doing is surprisingly menial when they arrive. And what's more is they're throwing off incredible amounts of profit for those who sit above them, the partners who actually hold the equity in the firm. Now, in this respect, I think diversity really matters. These are students, as you mentioned at the top, who are more indebted, who are more eager and delighted to be at the table in white shoe corporate law. Generationally, they are pioneers in some sense. 30 years ago, there would be no young Asian woman at a firm
Yeah.
working with Wall Street closely. So, in that sense, it's an incredible democratization of our elite. But at the
Yeah.
same time, their lives are much less clubby and gentlemanly and honestly bearable than a generation before. If you were a
Mm,
lawyer working at Cravath in the 50s, let's say,
mhm.
you build about 1,600 hours a year. So that's like a 40-hour work week with 2 weeks off for vacation.
Mhm.
potentially taxing, but not extreme.
Mhm.
At Skadden Arps, the most profitable law firm in the 1980s, associates, if they want to make partner, are billing 2,200 or 2,500 hours a year. That works out to 70 or 80-hour work weeks.
Yeah.
That's truly insane and unsustainable. And that's the point, right?
Yeah.
Because these firms
Yeah.
create a sort of pyramid structure with 4 associates toiling under every partner. They might not even see the partner for weeks. They just get assignments handed down to them through the senior associate who acts as a sort of foreman on the floor, to
Yeah.
use the factory metaphor. And there's no expectation that they'll make partner. The point is to extract profit from them, really sweat it out of them, maybe not literally, but sweat it out of them. And
Yeah.
then attrition is fine because there's always another class of more diverse and more indebted students waiting to take their place. Now, listen, how bad should we feel for them? I don't know. They are being paid the equivalent of about $180,000 a year. So, in that sense, they're not
Right.
immiserated, right? They can afford an apartment, they can afford fancy restaurants, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you look at the profit margins that are being extracted, I think it is quite exploitative. It's no
Yeah.
accident these workers call their firms sweatshops. It's a
Yeah.
little bit hyperbolic, but it captures something about their exploitation.
And as you talk about in the book, when you factor when you work it out by an hourly wage, it was something like $17 an hour.
Yeah, it's not that gaudy anymore once you do the math.
Yeah, yeah. And when you also talk about that, the work here is really quite unskilled in lots of cases, and also that there was very little opportunity to actually climb these increasingly corporate ladders. Um, yeah. So you mentioned, as you're talking here, I think like we begin to paint a picture of why people are drawn to these jobs,
Mm,
or you begin to get a picture of what the jobs are like. And there is, of course, a transformation of the surroundings of these people. So your book takes place largely in New York, but you also talk about how many of the dynamics in New York were then replicated elsewhere by politicians or leaders or whoever who wanted to replicate sort of the economic fortunes of the city changing in
mm,
in ways that we can debate the pros and cons of. Can you
sure.
talk about the neighborhood transformation that followed this influx of
Yeah.
yuppies? And maybe we should just define what yuppie means here.
I realize
Uh,
we haven't done
too.
that.
Yes, yes. So what is
So
a yuppie? And do not point at the other end of the camera.
right. Yep. J'accuse, right? And we can talk about that. Are we all yuppies? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
yuppie is
I
a
am
media
curious about that.
coinage in the early 80s, actually in Chicago, not New York, but it
Mhm.
stands for young urban professional. And it's a media stereotype the way we might hear about Gen Z does this, or,
Yeah,
it's a way of
yeah,
capturing emerging dynamics in the culture
yeah,
in a sort of journalistic thumbnail sketch. But it's a stereotype, right? It's a caricature. They're cartoonish, sort of. And yes, marketers are chasing them, but it's phantasmic. Like, who is this yuppie? Is it
mm,
real?
mm,
There
mm,
are
mm.
real things happening. Women are entering the professions. Some people are pulling away in terms of inequality from the rest of the middle class. Neighborhoods, as we'll talk about, are gentrifying. But what I wanted to see in my project was, are these in fact real people? And so what I did was, in my training as an urban historian, go to the neighborhoods where they're arriving. I thought I
Mhm.
have to actually find them on the ground to tell this story beyond the trend piece, that thumbnail sketch.
Yeah,
So I used some mapping tools to figure out with the census, where are people who work on Wall Street moving? Like, where do they actually live?
yeah.
Maybe
Well,
there's a story there.
let me pause here and let
Yeah.
anybody familiar with New York City guess think of a few neighborhoods in their minds, and
Drum
then okay,
roll.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, so some of the neighborhoods were expected, like, oh, the Upper East Side, fine. Greenwich, Connecticut, okay, expected. But what I
Mhm.
didn't expect was to see Hoboken, New Jersey,
Mm,
Park Slope suddenly be flooded with lawyers and bankers in the late 70s, early 80s. And that's
mhm.
sort of a mystery to me. So I went to the archives. Down in the files in the Hoboken Public Library and Historical Museum,
Mhm.
I found folders labeled fires. And almost in slow motion, as if it were cinematic, I put down the folder and the clippings pour out of these spate of arson fires, dozens and dozens of arson fires that accompanied the so-called renaissance of
Yeah,
a place like Hoboken. So
yeah,
what does that tell us? Well, we know about gentrification, again, in often sort of abstract terms, rising rents, displaced people, in some mechanism that's unclear to us, maybe. But what I found is that when yuppies arrive in these neighborhoods that have been changing, if slowly already, they bring with them a fire hose of real estate capital that utterly remakes the incentives for owners to displace their existing tenants and replace them directly with the young urban professionals who are desperate for housing in a market where vacancy rates are 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
And so in this story, just in Hoboken, I mean, 56 people die in intentional landlord arson fires. In Park Slope, landlords are withholding heat. Fires appear there too. On the Upper West Side, over 180,000 SRO, single room occupancy rooms, are forcibly emptied. And that correlates directly with the rise in the unhoused population. It's an utter transformation at the neighborhood level to house these young professionals who have a lot of capital to spend and in turn are attracting more investment capital from around the nation and indeed around the world.
Can you briefly just expound on that connection between the depletion of SROs and
Oh,
the
sure.
rise in the unhoused community?
Yeah, so their SROs are the very bottom of the rental market. They're these residential hotels you can pay by the night or the week for those who have no other option, whose other option will be living on the street or a shelter. And they fill neighborhoods like the Upper West Side. Also on the Bowery, there are other places, pockets of this. And for,
Yeah.
men who've lost their jobs in New York's disappearing manufacturing industries or shipyards, this is where they might live.
Hmm.
They, have a hot plate in the corner and a shared bathroom. And it's a tenuous but important hold on housing and stability.
Hmm.
Well, with the potential to convert these buildings into co-ops due to some loosening of the tax code, it's all in the book if you really want the details. But cities, the municipal government really wants these to so-called improve the demographic quality of the neighborhood. There are all sorts of tax incentives to remove those tenants,
Yeah.
get a tax break to convert to luxury apartments. And that's exactly what happens over and over again on the Upper West Side. In fact, owners of these buildings, these SROs, hire what are known as urban relocation specialists, which just means thugs, who will clear the building for them. And they'll wake you up in the middle of the night. They'll knock on the door. You'll push you into the hallway and they'll nail the door shut behind you. You have no
Yeah.
lease, right? You've
Yeah.
just paid
Yeah.
for the week. You're pushed down the stairs, and then, the building is sold a week later, cleared, and it becomes a luxury condo or co-op building.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
I mean,
stunning.
it is stunning and yeah, hard to read. Also, I grew up on the Upper West Side. So
Oh, so
so
you know this intimately.
I do. Yeah, it made me very curious about the history of my building, a pre-war building,
Hmm.
which then my family was later sort of pushed out of as it was turned into luxury condos. But
Oh, interesting.
um,
Well,
yeah,
eventually these changes come for the middle class. They work their way up as those
yeah,
with outsized
right,
incomes look to expand the ambit.
right. I think you
Yeah.
no, please.
No, go ahead.
No, I just think like the thought that went through my head a lot through this book, and that you circle at different points is like, and I do want to touch on I want to go back to the fires for a second too, but it's just like you talk about the values of yuppies, and we'll get into this in I guess the politics section of the conversation, but there is like this yuppies and neoliberals, liberals, conservatives, a growing coalition of people gravitate toward, I guess conservatives wouldn't gravitate toward this, but toward being like, on one hand, we believe in sort of social progress. And on the other, like it's a dog eat dog world and you can get yours, I'm going to get mine. And this individualistic mentality that pervades Wall Street and the legal world as well, the handmaidens of Wall Street, as we're talking about, and then, invades, neighborhoods, leads to,
Hmm.
neighborhood transformation and arson. It just, I just keep coming back to that. Like you cannot, the history I think bears out over and over again that you cannot reconcile an individualistic mentality of like, capitalistic ethos of I'm going to get mine. And also like everything's going to get better for
Well,
people at the
can
same
I
time.
explain how they try to square this circle? Because I think it's
Please,
actually really important.
please.
The work that meritocracy does here cannot be
Mm,
overstated. Because on the
mm,
one hand, it is a more democratic elite. In the democratic small d, it's more
yeah.
diverse, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
Barack Obama is the editor of the Harvard Law Review in the early 90s and then president. That is a marked change
Yeah. Yeah.
from some decades before. And on one
Yeah.
hand, I'm quite sympathetic to the opening of that
That's a great point.
world
Yeah.
to those who work hard, right? Like I don't want to discount those changes. Like 40% of law students are female by the end of the 80s. Another remarkable
Yeah.
change. But on the other hand, it's an increasingly unequal political economy that someone like Barack Obama presides over. So to reconcile that, that's where meritocracy comes in. It says, well, this class is open to any and all who are willing to work hard. Look, we've got women, we've got a smattering of people of color. We must have solved the problem of race. And thus, if you haven't found your way into this elect that's pulling further and further away in terms of economics, maybe you're deficient in some way, right? It's
Yeah,
what does
yeah,
Clinton use? He uses the language of responsibility.
yeah,
He's going to retrain the workers, but it's on them ultimately. They're responsible to find a job in a deindustrializing economy, to use their smarts to leverage up into the post-industrial working
yeah,
world.
yeah.
And that's an incredibly blinkered view. But, liberals do, in some abstract way, want to achieve equality. They just think they're going to get the gains from Wall Street and then somehow, in a bank shot, accomplish it. I don't
Yeah.
see it happening, but it is different than what the right is doing with deregulation, which is more openly rapacious. Who cares about equality?
Well, I mean, this is this would be we're going to James Baldwin in some sense of being like who would say, I much prefer the conservative who is openly being rapacious than the person who thinks they are not, but actually is in some sense. Um,
Well said.
and I also, so we're talking about the arson and this. I mean, this history intersects, of course, with Bench Ansfield's book, which I'm sure you're familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
which I was, also phenomenal text.
Yeah, their work's amazing.
Yes. Oh my God. And we have, yeah, that book blew my mind in similar ways that yours is, and that you talk about too. There is a larger history too of it's not just these local incentives that are changing. There are federal incentives to lots of these things, and or to insurance plans rising up that make it more profitable for landlords to set fire to their buildings
Mm-hmm.
than to care for the people in them, and also to try to usher in more affluent residents, yuppies, if you will. And as this happens, or as these neighborhoods transform, the culture of the city changes too. And politicians, as you talk about, the mayors of the city are into these changes or support these
Yes,
changes.
certainly.
And the yuppies get into because you talk about meritocracy. Yuppies get into some things that sort of mirror those values of meritocracy and individualism, and places where they can flaunt their wealth, and also you sort of find an avenue to escape from their jobs. Can you talk about you talk about the title mentions the gourmands, if you will,
Yes.
enchanté, and also the joggers who yeah, I'll come for the joggers. Can you talk about some of these these cultural changes that happen in the state at the same time?
Yeah, so we can actually use meritocracy as a bridge from the story about inequality that's happening on the streets into the realm of culture, because there's sort of cultural work being done in the realm of consumption and taste for yuppies to understand, how am I sitting atop this highly unequal social pyramid? Like, why do I deserve it? And in some way, taste ratifies that position atop the hierarchy,
Interesting.
because taste reflects all of the cultural savoir-faire that yuppies have accumulated in those fancy colleges. In that summer,
Savoir faire. Yeah.
yeah, I just did it, right?
Yeah.
Gourmand. Um, like, taste is a realm in which to enact and to even exacerbate inequality, and to mystify it under the guise of rightful, uh, you know, connoisseurship for them. So
Yeah.
in the realm of food, we see it in the stereotypes of the yuppies. They're always accompanied by a bottle of Perrier and a slice of brie. That's how the journalists portray them.
Hmm.
But there is a real transformation in middle class taste in this era. We
Mm.
can imagine, we can go back to, Liz Cohen and the Consumers Republic. And sure, there were gradations in GM's car levels by income, but taste was broad and middle class, and marketers thought about it as sort of homogeneous, if white and suburban, middle class, Mr. and Mrs. Consumer, they called them.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
what happens in an era of inequality that opens up in the 70s is that the middle class really breaks in two. There's a downwardly mobile tranche of people who are seeing their real wages actually fall
Yeah.
as deindustrialization sets in, mortgage rates go up, energy costs skyrocket. And on the other hand, young urban professionals, the yuppies I'm writing about, are often pairing off with another professional. They're delaying childbirth. They're not paying for a suburban house. All the markers of sort of heteronormative suburban life are pushed off to enjoy what they call heedless consumption for now. And that's exactly what they do. They take those earnings, that importantly, their disposable income, and splash it out in the realm of restaurants and gourmet food. So this is the
Yeah.
gourmands in the title. And I dive into, with no small amount of relish, pun intended, this world of New York gourmet culture that emerges in this period. And it's so familiar to us now from the sort of foodie moment where
Yeah.
people seek distinction through consuming what's seen as exotic or novel or requires sophisticated education to understand. That really
Yeah.
has its origins in this period where elite taste before was invariably French. It was boring. It wasn't that good. It wasn't that delicious. The vegetables weren't very fresh.
Yeah.
But after the counterculture teaches educated Americans that actually the authentic, the folk, the rustic can be valued,
Yeah.
elite taste becomes more omnivorous. You could eat arugula you bought from the green market, which conveniently opens in the late 70s.
Yeah.
The strong dollar can buy you something called an avocado. And you can tell stories about how you discovered it to your
Yeah.
friends and gain amount of social credit and capital through that wise consumption.
Yeah, yeah. This chapter, and also the jogging stuff. Yeah, well, I guess we can weave the marathon into this history too, which
Hmm.
which comes about this around the same exact time in the late 70s. Yeah, this is. I mean, this. I was beginning to reflect on my own like identity in New
Yeah.
York. I mean, at various points throughout the book, but I am like I'm very vegetable forward. I am very vegetable forward and fresh fruit. Like I am at the farmer's market every weekend.
Yeah.
Now, it's a purely utilitarian experience for me. Like anybody who's there to like meander through the farmer's market drives me mad. I don't, it's not like I'm not there for
Get down to
appearances.
business.
Seriously, I'm like, get your child and get your dog out of the way. They're lovely. I'm sure they're lovely. Like I would love to hang out with you in a more relaxed setting, but this is not relaxed for me. This is go time. And uh and so I guess there's some things there that I'm thinking about. Another thing I'm thinking about as you talk about the rise of the restaurant industry and foodies is like this is another example I think too of increasing diversity and exploitation
Right.
because the opening of this gourmand world does open up opportunities for people in ways that maybe didn't exist before, and of course there's massive exploitation that comes alongside that too.
There's a real democratization of what's considered elite. Like you can go to a Mexican dive and get social credit by consuming those foods. Like that
Yeah.
in some regard is a opening up of elite taste. It's not just the
Yeah.
stuffy French restaurants. But on the other hand, you're using that as material for distinction, for class distinction.
Yeah.
And that does reflect the broader inequalities, especially as retailers pivot away from the down market middle class and chase the yuppie consumer, leaving behind sort of the rest of the Americans on the downward path.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to be conscious of time.
Of course.
And make sure we give ourselves time to talk about
Yeah.
the watershed moment for liberalism. But can you please talk about the rise of the marathon? Another example of things that have pros and cons, but also drive me mad.
So I am profoundly alienated by those who are obsessed with running, and so I needed to historicize its origin. I lived in New York, and you could see
Yeah.
certain neighborhoods were filled with runners and athleisure, and
Yeah.
other neighborhoods, black or brown or poorer, were not. And so
Mm.
I understood it to be a class-linked activity, but I didn't understand its history.
Mm.
And so running in the city is a leisure activity that the city actually seizes upon quite consciously as a way of reviving its image at its nadir.
Mm.
In 1976, the city is in the midst of this fiscal crisis. Its fortunes could not be worse. 500,000 jobs have evaporated. And the image of
Shout out
New York
Robert
is this,
Moses in some
yeah,
sense.
there you
Yes.
go. It's a hellhole to the rest of America. Well, there are some green shoots. The young people who are jogging through Central Park who've taken up this vogue for, as they called it at the time, jogging, are noticed by people like, literally, I have interviews with a banker who sees them on his commute and says, "Oh, these are the young, beautiful, upscale people I'd love to have bank with us. Can I get my name on their t-shirt?" And so he approaches city leaders, the Manhattan Borough President Percy Sutton, the mayor Abe Beame, and later Ed Koch, and says, "This is a great way to market the city. We need some money, though. Where do they go?" The real estate industry, the Rudin family, who's deeply invested in stoking real estate values, says, "Sure, we'll kick in money for a 5-borough marathon." And in 1976, 50 years ago, is the first iteration of this race. 90% of the participants are white collar workers. It is a profoundly class linked activity, but that's by design. This is exactly how New York wants to portray its hopeful future. The cameras are panning over the Verrazano Bridge as these young, fit, attractive people are jogging over, and these images are broadcast by the early 80s to 50 million people around the world. They're used in promoting material for Perrier water, of course, but also Columbia University, institutions that are invested in a new phoenix like image of the city with these yuppies at the vanguard. And for yuppies themselves, running becomes another venue to express meritocratic achievement. I talked to some people who still remember their finishing times from 5Ks in the early 80s. I mean,
Yeah.
sicko behavior, but it links with, these are the same people who could remember their profit and loss statistics from the same year.
Yeah.
So this sort of rigorous competition in the white collar world, in the financial deal making, echoes and is even encouraged by this physical activity they're using in their leisure time. They turn their leisure into work, all to maximize their feeling that they own this city
Yeah.
and they're sitting atop this unequal hierarchy.
Yeah. Well stated and synthesized. And I think there is something very fitting about this image, which you talk about in the book, of these white collar workers. I mean, as you do talk about in the book, that it's the marathon, again, to sort of nuance the history some, the marathon is embraced by neighborhoods all over the city. It's like it actually works in some sense of
Yes.
being something that like everybody like almost universally gets behind.
Right. I don't want to be cynical enough to say, oh, this is just a blatant branding exercise. No, in fact, they
Yeah.
run through the South Bronx and Harlem and are cheered
Yeah.
on by a diverse cast of New Yorkers. Television cameras had not been in Brooklyn since 1957 when the Dodgers left. It
Yeah.
is a signal accomplishment to get them back there and broadcast those images. And it's part of this wider effort to rebrand the city for a new type of tourist and a new type of
Right.
yuppie who might want to live there. So I'm both cynical about the intent, but also,
Yeah.
I can celebrate a day when 2 million New Yorkers are lined up cheering on each other. That's not the worst thing, even if yuppies are
Yeah.
at the very vanguard.
Well, speak for yourself. I, uh, I mean, I do. There is just something. Yeah, I think it might be like as you talk about in the book, as I try to sort of get a grasp of like what just like grosses me out about the marathon in some sense. Like it is lots of positivity, but it also feels very. It's papering over a lot of ills, and I think it's something you
Yes.
talk about as a symbol, but people are and readers, listeners, please come for me. I'm happy to discuss the marathon more because it'll help me flesh out my thoughts more. I mean, you're not going to change my mind, but you might. But it's like it is very symbolic that these people who are making huge amounts of money while being exploited, are running through neighborhoods that they are making worse in some sense by pushing people more to the fringes, by draining money from. They're not themselves draining money from the safety net, but that ethos is part of this world that they
Absolutely.
are that they are bought into.
And
Literally.
that's where the service workers whose restaurant labor they're enjoying have to go live because they can't afford to live in those core neighborhoods anymore after gentrification sweeps them. So, yes,
And they
with
run
each
through
footfall, they're
looking
sort
at
of
them.
claiming ownership of these
Yeah.
spaces.
Yeah. While just like passing through them, looking at them, as they run through. It's like you can run
Yeah.
by and sort of acknowledge them and then you've done your part or something like that. I don't know.
No, there's something there. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. I find it rather infuriating, but I've never run the marathon, so I don't know what it's like, and I never will. Now, I want to talk about, we're talking about, I knew when I started this, when I started this book, I would come for the marathon. My sister is always like, what is your fucking problem with the marathon? It's so fun. Like, there's so much joy on the streets. And I'm like, I can't tell you why, but it drives. Okay. So, and I guess related to all these things too, is we've alluded to this already, but there is a change in politics that
Yeah.
comes with these changes that we're talking about with young urban professionals going to Wall Street in bigger numbers, going to law firms in bigger numbers, changing cities, rising arson, gourmands, whatever. There's lots of changes, and they are represented in some ways by, you talk about a senator who was running for office and spoke to these young people young runners in a running outfit. Can you talk about this moment in time and this watershed moment for liberalism as you describe it?
Absolutely. So in the media portrayals of the year of the yuppie, say, in Newsweek, this package of stories in 1984, it really crystallizes as a media stereotype around Gary Hart, who's a senator from Colorado. And yet again, I wanted to see, well, is there any truth to this sort of
Hmm.
media first draft of history? Is there a reorientation of the Democratic Party that's happening well before Clinton enters the national picture? Can we push back our story about
Yeah.
liberalism, reorientation towards a financialized economy, towards a
Yeah.
white collar professional class constituency to an earlier period? Well, guess what? I think I've done it. I think I've shown how Wall Street and particularly the Democrats come to be locked in a tight embrace much earlier than we've assumed. We know, or most of us know, that by 2008, Barack Obama gets more money from Wall Street lawyers and bankers than any candidate, Republican or Democrat, before. This is a watershed transformation from our images of, we think that big money donates to Republicans. But actually, as banks diversify, as Jewish law firms move to the center of American life, capital splits into different camps. And savvy politicians like Chuck Schumer, who not coincidentally lives in Park Slope, in one of the gentrifying neighborhoods I write about,
Yeah.
realize that the new money center for the party will not be the AFL-CIO. It will not be the urban machines or the African American working class. It's the new rising class of yuppies who will have the dollars and the political influence and sort of the
Mm.
story, the meritocratic story to tell that will push liberalism into a new generation. And so Gary Hart in 1984 is the sort of first salvo in what would become a wave of political power for
Yeah.
yuppies. It's early, he loses, but he articulates a vision of a technocratic society with finance and high technology at its very core, sort of in the image of the yuppie. And he enjoys their dollars, their donations. And he, not coincidentally, gets an endorsement from Chuck Schumer, who bucks the party that's supporting Mondale to support Hart. So here we can see the contours of a new sort of Democratic Party that, in some abstract way, still wants to achieve equality, wants to achieve growth in order to enact that, but sees growth as coming through these post-industrial, highly educated workers at the
Yeah.
center, really replacing Archie Bunker with a yuppie at the core of the Democratic project. And
Yeah.
we sort of know how this worked in the subsequent decades.
Yeah, there's this move away from a working class or union based and working class African American based coalition to something different. I think, and going back to what that something different is, and going back to what we were talking about before, you say from their perch on Wall Street, this constituency believed that the growth fostered by a looser financial sector could be marshaled to solve social problems. To deregulation, sorry, I'm just reading,
Yeah.
taking it in all over again. Deregulation wouldn't just be profitable in a roundabout way, it might also deliver equality. And I think that, and you go on, I mean, there's so many quotes here that, but you say, there's a quote here from someone saying that Hart, someone said, could count on the support of these quote unquote socially conscious businessmen, lawyers, and bankers who all believe in a free market economy.
Right. You have people
Which,
like Bruce Wasserstein who like were sympathetic to the civil rights movement.
yeah,
They were like
yeah,
student, not quite radicals, but somewhere on the left liberal coalition.
yeah,
But they find themselves at law school and all of a sudden they're whisked into a bank or law firm. And they maintain some of the sympathies for liberal causes, yet in their day jobs are enacting rapacious financialization on the rest of the economy.
yeah,
And so their donations and their political advocacy reflects a sort of complicated and often quite tense marriage
yeah,
between those two impulses, um, with no small
yeah.
amount of disaster for everyone else.
Well, yeah. Can you talk some about the as we reach the end of the conversation, can you talk about the legacy of these changes? I mean, we've talked about them in many ways, and I think readers and listeners will feel them uh,
Yeah.
as the conversation goes on. But you talk about this legacy is not just felt in New York, and it's certainly felt here. You talk about in the book, you talk about Bloomberg being sort of the epitome of many of these yuppie values, and also we still feel them too. And of course, there are things that Bloomberg did that I think a lot of people like in terms of like opening up the streets in ways that hadn't been
Mhm.
done before. And Jeanette Sadiq Khan, one of the person who led that effort for him, is now back in the mayor's office.
She's in my book too. She worked on Gary Hart's campaign.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So there are lots of people who come out of this Hart campaign who shape liberal politics in the years to come in ways that are good and bad. And of course, Bloomberg, when we talk about the bad, who, by the way, was I loved all of the memes of Bloomberg being run over at the Knicks game the other day. Um, Bloomberg was, of course, ushered in an era, I mean, his own era of stop and frisk, of really
Yeah.
discriminatory policing, which expanded on broken windows policing under Braden, which came in the early 90s. Like, there's lots of deepening of discrimination at the same time that's
I
peaked
try and
things up.
cover this very briskly in the epilogue, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah,
Bloomberg
yeah,
is the apotheosis of the Yuppie city. It's no accident he creates the computer terminal that allows finance to
yeah,
whisk profits out of the rest of the country and into New York's coffers. He is himself presiding over what he calls the luxury city. It's not for everyone, he says. It's not Walmart. We want the world's best and brightest here at
yeah,
whatever cost. And with this comes the rezoning, say, of former industrial areas like the Williamsburg waterfront, where many of the new wave of Wall Street private equity workers will go live. And as you mentioned, the disciplinary force of incarceration and policing to discipline those who are left out of this new economy. New York looks increasingly like a hourglass in terms of its social structure. Yuppies at the top enjoying the outsized profits. Finance workers take home about 35% of the wages in New York in Bloomberg's tenure. They're only
yeah,
4% of the population. They spend that
yeah,
money on the low wage service workers who provide them the social reproductive pleasures that they're looking for: childcare, food, nail salons, on and on. So, this is the social
yeah.
structure that
P&P.
Bloomberg presides over, and using force to discipline those who don't fit anywhere in this new social order is one of the consequences
Yeah.
to keep the yuppie city safe.
And as you talk about in the book too, these dynamics that we're talking about in New York and the rising inequality, they're not New York explicit, they're not New York exclusive dynamics.
Yeah.
It's exactly these dynamics that Trump, exacerbates. I was going to say, yeah, of course he exacerbates them, but also preys upon or actually calls out, I should say more accurately in some sense, to develop a coalition that also feels that what is rising, that is represented by what's rising out of New York City and other cities that replicate the New York's draw of or eagerness to draw yuppies to them, that there's something deeply off
Mm.
about that. And
I think that people misdiagnose Trump as a yuppie. He is profoundly not. He's a creature of 1980s New York, but importantly, he's an outer borough striver who does not get accepted by the core of the yuppie taste culture, by the
yeah,
real estate families who never quite admit him into their circles, and that resentment over his rejections and really his continuing sympathies with the white ethnics in the outer boroughs who are, their racist fears are mounting in an era of rising crime. He's more sympathetic with that revanchist revenge tenor. And his
yeah,
resentments over rejection are exactly what rhymes with the guy in Staten Island who's lost his job, with the guy in Alabama who's watched the plant move away. It's
yeah,
actually the hatred of yuppies and this cosmopolitan, diverse, importantly, elite that they represent that
yeah,
explains why, say, DEI is so central, the attack on it is so central, why he's seeking to bring universities to heal, because these are the training grounds for yuppies, right? These are the credentialing institutions that produce the elite that rejected him and is seen as, fairly or not, sneering at those who are less cosmopolitan, who don't have a place in this new economy.
yeah.
So I think Trump is actually the yuppies, revenge against the yuppies rather than being one himself.
And yet, ironically, at the same time, now that same elite is beginning to court him more and more. Like people who
Oh,
we might have
God.
termed yuppies, right, are now beginning to court. It's like if the law firms in New York City now don't want to cross Trump. The same law
They're
firms that,
nothing if not mercenary, right? If we've
yeah,
learned anything.
yes, which I think goes back to a point where I'm not sure you can have, a deep desire for the free market and also social progress at the same time. And I think I'll just end with a quote of yours, because you have a lovely epilogue to the book, which I'll encourage people to read. But you say if your book has done anything, it's put a spotlight on the specific policies and structures that called yuppies into being. If one can learn anything from confronting this history, it is that if a class can be made, it can also be unmade. All right. All right. I mean,
Let's do it, folks.
let's do it. Let's do it. Let's hope that maybe because they're all at Madison Square Garden. Well,
But I
actually,
regret, Ben, that'll mean no more farmers markets for you.
okay.
Off to the
Well,
gulag with the rest of us,
okay. Well,
me
now,
included.
I mean, now I'm rethinking everything. Well, okay, Dylan, thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your time. I think you've drawn, I mean, even at the end here, you're putting a spotlight on some of the nuances and contradictions of the history that I'll be sitting with for a long time and evaluating my place in and the city's history and the country's history in. And yeah, just really Really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, and go Knicks.
Go Knicks. That's
Let's do
right.
this. Bring it home.
Okay, Knicks in 5.